Picture the high plains of the American West in the summer of 1876. The grass runs to the horizon in every direction, an ocean of it, bending under a wind that has crossed 1,000 miles of open country without meeting a single fence. The sky is enormous. There are no roads here worth the name, no telegraph poles, no towns, only the great emptiness that maps of the age still marked as unknown. And moving through that emptiness, in wagons and on horseback, came a restless nation reaching for something it could not yet see. Along the rivers and the ridgelines, a hard collision was already underway. Soldiers in blue rode north into the Montana Territory, and the tribes of the northern plains gathered in numbers no living man had ever counted. On a hot afternoon in late June, beside a stream the Lakota called the Greasy Grass, and the map makers called the Little Bighorn, the two worlds met in a fury of dust and gunfire. When the counting began, historians and archaeologists would later find, scattered across that battlefield, the spent brass of hundreds of repeating rifles. Many bore a single name stamped into the metal. That name was Winchester. By then, the name had already traveled further west than most of the men who carried it. It rode in saddle scabbards from Texas to the Dakotas and hung over the mantles of cabins from the Rio Grande to the Canadian line. It was carried by lawmen and outlaws, buffalo hunters and cattlemen, by settlers who had staked everything on a patch of ground far from home, and by the tribes and soldiers who fought over that ground. In a single generation, this one rifle had become as much a part of the frontier as the horse and the campfire, a kind of promise that a lone family, far from any help, could feed and defend themselves against whatever the country threw at them. But the story of that rifle did not begin on the plains. It began in a brick factory in a crowded New England city, in the hands of a man who had never fired a shot in anger and knew almost nothing about guns. It began with shirts. This is the story of Winchester, the rifle that won the West, and the great New Haven factory that built it. For nearly a century and a half, one plant in Connecticut poured out the tools of American expansion, arming a young country as it crossed a continent, then arming it again through 2 world wars. This is the story of the men who built it, and the armory that turned iron and brass and gunpowder into a legend. Oliver Fisher. Winchester was not born to guns, and for most of his life, he showed no interest in them at all. He came into the world on the 30th of November in the year 1810 in Boston, Massachusetts. His father died when Oliver was still a small boy, and the family had little. As a young man, he worked with his hands on farms and learned the carpenter's trade. He was a man of the rising Northeast, where the first great factories were beginning to hum, and he understood what many men of his time did not, that the future belonged to those who could make things quickly, cheaply, and in enormous numbers. Winchester found his first fortune not in weapons, but in clothing. He had run a men's furnishing store in Baltimore, but his real talent lay in manufacturing. In the 1840s, he moved into the making of men's shirts, holding a patent on an improved method of cutting and sewing that let the garment be produced on a large scale by machine rather than by the slow hand of a single tailor. In 1848, he established a shirt-making operation in New Haven, Connecticut, joining in time with a partner named John Davies. The firm they built, Winchester and Davies, became one of the great success stories of New England manufacturing. He made shirts fast and cheap and in great numbers by dividing the work into simple steps that ordinary hands could perform. In its first year, the business turned a profit of something under $20,000. Within roughly a decade, it was taking in on the order of $300,000 a year, a staggering sum for the middle of the 19th century. Oliver Winchester had made himself wealthy by mastering the machine age, and he was, above all, an industrialist who believed in the power of the factory. And it was as a rich shirt manufacturer looking for the next place to put his money that Winchester first stumbled into the strange world of the repeating firearm. In the year 18, 55, he invested in a struggling little enterprise called the Volcanic Repeating Arms Company, which had emerged from an earlier partnership between two now famous gunmakers, Horace Smith and Daniel Wesson. It was built around an intriguing but deeply flawed idea, a pistol that could fire many shots in quick succession. The concept was brilliant. The execution was not. Its self-contained ammunition was so weak that critics joked it could scarcely be trusted to kill a rabbit. The company failed, in the kind of failure that ruined ordinary investors. But where others saw a lost cause, Winchester saw an opportunity. He gathered up control of the wreckage, becoming the principal stockholder, and in 1857 he reorganized the whole enterprise under a new name, the New Haven Arms Company. He moved its operations into the industrial heart of his home city, and set about doing to guns what he had already done to shirts. Here we must be honest about the man. Oliver Winchester was not an inventor. What he possessed was rarer: vision and patience and capital, and an unshakable faith that the repeating firearm was the future of the gun. Every other maker of the age was still building single-shot weapons that had to be laboriously reloaded after each shot. Winchester looked at the crippled little Volcanic and saw, buried inside its failures, the seed of a weapon that could fire again and again without pause. All he needed was a man who could solve the problems he himself could not. That man was already standing on his factory floor. His name was Benjamin Tyler Henry. Henry was everything Winchester was not: a craftsman and a gunmaker to the bone, who understood metal and machinery with his hands as well as his head. He had trained in the great armories of New England, in the shops where the American system of interchangeable parts was still being invented. Winchester made him plant superintendent and handed him the central problem, the one that had killed the Volcanic and would kill the whole venture. The problem was the ammunition. Henry attacked it with brilliance. He threw out the weak Volcanic charge and designed something far better: a proper metallic cartridge, a copper case holding both powder and bullet. This became the .44 caliber Henry rimfire, and it changed everything. It was reliable, reasonably powerful, and it could be stacked in a long tube beneath the barrel and cycled through the gun one after another. Around it, Henry built a new rifle, reworking the toggle link action of the old Volcanic into a smooth, strong mechanism that could feed, fire, extract, and eject with a single stroke of a lever behind the trigger. He received a United States patent for his design in October of 1860, and the weapon that bore his name entered the world. The Henry rifle was a marvel. In an age when nearly every soldier on Earth carried a muzzle-loading musket, the Henry held 16 rounds in its magazine. To fire a musket, a soldier had to tear open a paper cartridge, pour the powder, ram home the ball, fit a percussion cap, and cock the hammer before he could aim, a sequence a well-drilled man might complete 2 or 3 times a minute. The soldier with a Henry did none of that. Each time he worked the lever, a fresh cartridge slid into place, and a trained man could empty all 16 rounds in seconds. Against such rifles, the old tactics of massed men marching shoulder to shoulder became a recipe for slaughter, and then came the war that would prove it. When the American Civil War broke out in 1861, the Henry rifle found its proving ground, while the great armies of the Union and the Confederacy still marched with single-shot muzzleloaders. Most Henrys were bought privately, by individual soldiers, and by units who pooled their pay for the best weapon money could buy. The United States government purchased only a fraction of the total, a little over 1,700, out of some 14,000 ever built. But those that reached the front left a mark on everyone who faced them. There is a phrase that has come down through the years, attributed to a Confederate soldier describing the terror of charging into that wall of fire. He is said to have called it that damned Yankee rifle that you load on Sunday and shoot all week. No one can now trace those exact words to a single source, so they belong more to legend than to history. But they capture a truth the records confirm. The age of loading once and firing once was ending, and the men on the receiving end knew it first. By the time the guns of the Civil War fell silent, the repeating rifle had proven itself beyond argument and Oliver Winchester's long gamble was about to pay off. But first, the partnership at the heart of the company came apart. Benjamin Tyler Henry, believing he had never been fairly rewarded, moved to seize control of the company, pressing to have it reorganized under his own name and citing the value of his patent. It was a reasonable claim from a proud man. But Winchester was, above all, a businessman, and he moved faster. In the year 1866, he reorganized the enterprise once more, and this time stamped it with his own name. The New Haven Arms Company became the Winchester Repeating Arms Company. Benjamin Tyler Henry departed, bitterly, his name attached forever to the rifle he had designed, but not to the empire it had founded. Yet the company that emerged would carry the repeating rifle further than either man could have dreamed, out past the edge of the settled country and into the making of a nation. The first rifle to wear the Winchester name arrived in that same year, and almost from the first day, the men who carried it gave it a nickname that stuck. They called it the Yellow Boy for its receiver, which Winchester cast from a golden-hued alloy of brass and bronze that gleamed against the dark walnut and blue steel. It took everything that had made the Henry great and fixed the flaws that had held it back. The old Henry had been loaded through the front of its magazine, an awkward and fragile arrangement. The new model of 1866 added a spring-loaded gate on the side of the receiver, so a rider could thumb fresh cartridges into the gun quickly, even on horseback, and gained a solid wooden forearm so a man could steady the weapon without burning his hand. It was stronger, simpler, and far better suited to the brutal life of the frontier. The model of 1866 was in Shotdaiti. Immediate and lasting success. Over a run stretching to the very end of the century, Winchester turned out something on the order of 170,000 of them. They armed settlers pushing into Kansas and Nebraska and found their way into the hands of the Plains tribes, who prized them above almost any other possession and gave the repeating rifle names of their own, the many shots and the spirit gun. And the Yellow Boy went abroad. Oliver Winchester, the old shirt salesman who had learned to sell to the whole country, now set out to sell to the whole world. And large orders came in from foreign governments and distant armies, from the Ottoman Empire and beyond. This was the pattern that would define the company. It did not build a good rifle and wait for buyers, but made rifles by the hundreds of thousands and then went out and sold them, because Oliver Winchester understood that the gun was only half the business and the factory the other half. By the end of the 1860s, the company that had begun as a rescued scrap of a failed pistol maker had become a rising power in American industry, about to build the single most famous rifle in the history of the American West. That rifle was the model of 1873, and more than any other weapon ever made, it earned a title that has echoed down the years. It became known, in Winchester's own advertising and in the popular memory of the nation, as the gun that won the West. It took the proven design of the Yellow Boy and answered its two last weaknesses. The soft brass frame could not stand up to a truly powerful cartridge, so Winchester replaced it with a receiver of solid steel, able to handle far greater pressures. And the old rimfire cartridge gave way to a more potent round, the 44-40, a centerfire cartridge that hit harder and reached farther. Now the Winchester was not just a fast rifle, but a serious one, a weapon a man could trust to bring down large game or defend his life at real distances across the plains. The model of 1873 became one of the defining objects of its age. Winchester built more than 720,000 of them and kept building them in one form or another for nearly half a century, all the way to the year 1919. It rode with cattlemen up the trails from Texas to the railheads of Kansas, and with the lawmen and outlaws whose names would pass into legend alongside it. And there was a touch of marketing genius in the way it fed. Colt began chambering its famous single-action revolver for that same 44-40 cartridge, so a frontiersman could carry a rifle and a pistol that both fed from the same box of ammunition. Together, the Winchester rifle and the Colt revolver became the twin icons of the armed frontier, and that image has never left the American imagination. But behind those hundreds of thousands of rifles stood something even more remarkable: the factory. And to understand Winchester, you have to understand New Haven. In the year 1870, the firm raised the first of the permanent buildings that would grow over the next several decades into one of the largest armament plants on the face of the earth, a vast complex that swallowed block after block of the city. By the late 1880s, the plant employed more than 600 workers. By the turn of the century, it covered more than 6 full city blocks, sprawling across a tract of some 75 acres, and its workforce had climbed well past 1,000 and was still growing. Try to see it as the people of New Haven saw it. Great brick buildings rising 4 and 5 stories, their thousands of windows glowing at dusk, the ground trembling from the drop hammers and presses. Inside ran one of the most sophisticated manufacturing systems the world had yet produced, the American system of manufacture. Every part of every rifle made identical, so one could be swapped for another without a gunsmith's hand fitting. Barrels were forged and bored and rifled, receivers milled from solid steel, and levers and hammers and springs and walnut stocks each shaped in their turn. In the New Haven works, each part was made by the thousand on dedicated machines, to such fine tolerances that anyone would drop into place in any rifle without a file ever touching it, converging on the assembly benches where finished rifles took shape, shift after shift. The factory was, in truth, the real invention. Only a great industrialist could build a machine that turned out fine rifles by the trainload, year after year, an engine of mass production that made the Winchester as common on the frontier as the cast iron stove and the wagon wheel. The plant became a small city of labor, drawing in wave after wave of workers, many of them immigrants newly arrived from Europe who found in those workshops a foothold and a wage that could feed a family. Whole neighborhoods grew up in the shadow of the Winchester walls, and for generations of New Haven families, the name Winchester meant not a legend of the frontier, but simply the place where they worked. And the man who had built it did not live to see its greatest days. Oliver Fisher Winchester died in December of the year 1880 at his home in New Haven. He had risen from a fatherless boy on a New England farm to become one of the wealthiest industrialists in America, and even a lieutenant governor of Connecticut. He left behind a company at the height of its confidence and a rifle already becoming a legend. But it still faced a question that would decide its future. The lever-action rifles that had carried it so far were about to meet a new age of gunpowder and engineering, and to conquer it, Winchester would need a genius greater than any it had yet employed. His name was John Moses Browning. If Oliver Winchester was the great industrialist of the story, and Benjamin Tyler Henry its first inventive spark, then Browning was something rarer still, one of the greatest firearms designers who ever lived, whose guns would shape warfare and hunting for a century after his death. The son of a frontier gunsmith, he understood the flow of force through a mechanism the way a musician understands a melody. In the year 1883, Winchester secured the services of the most fertile gun-designing mind in America. The partnership that followed was one of the most productive in the history of manufacturing. Over roughly the next 2 decades, Browning designed for Winchester a whole family of firearms. There was the single-shot model of 1885, prized by target shooters for its falling block action. There were the big lever-action rifles, the model of 1886, and the model of 1892, which solved a problem that had haunted the lever gun from the beginning. The old toggle link actions were not strong enough for the heaviest cartridges of the day, so Browning designed a new system built around sliding vertical locking bars that braced the breech like the pillars of a bridge, giving the lever action the strength to fire the powerful rounds big game hunters demanded. There were shotguns too, including the famous pump-action model of 1897 that would serve hunters and soldiers alike for generations. But of everything the two created together, one rifle would outlast and outsell them all. It was the model of 1894, and it arrived at the dawn of a revolution in gunpowder itself. For centuries, every firearm on Earth had burned black powder, which fouled the barrel after only a few shots, and threw up a great cloud of white smoke that gave away a hidden marksman's position. Now, a new propellant was appearing. Smokeless powder, cleaner and vastly more powerful, capable of pushing a bullet to speeds the old powder could never reach, and doing it with barely a wisp of smoke. The model of 1894 was built to harness it. When it first appeared, it was chambered for older cartridges, but the very next year, Winchester introduced for it a new round designed around the new powder, the 30-30, a landmark as the first commercial sporting cartridge in America, loaded with smokeless powder, carrying the first jacketed bullets offered to the ordinary hunter. With it, the model of 1894 became the deer rifle of the American continent, a light, fast, hard-hitting weapon that a farmer or a woodsman could sling over his shoulder and trust for a lifetime. And trust it they did, in numbers almost beyond comprehension. The model of 1894 became the best-selling sporting rifle in the history of the world. Across the long decades of its production, Winchester and its successors would turn out more than 6 million of them. It became so common in barns and pickup trucks and hunting cabins that for millions of people, the word Winchester and the shape of that trim lever gun became one and the same thing. If the model of 1873 had won the West in the age of the frontier, the model of 1894 owned the woods and fields of the settled country that came after. There was one more piece to the empire, not a gun at all, but the ammunition. From its earliest days, the company understood that a rifle was only as good as the cartridges it fired, and Winchester built up an enormous business making its own by the countless million. Every rifle that left New Haven created a lifelong customer, and the company came to make ammunition, not only for its own guns, but for the guns of half the country. The name Winchester on a green and yellow box of cartridges, as familiar in the general store as the rifle in the rack behind the counter. By the end of the 19th century, between the Browning lever guns, the shotguns, the Great New Haven factory, and the ammunition works, Winchester stood at the summit of the American arms industry, and then the world went to war. When the First World War engulfed the globe in the second decade of the 20th century, the Winchester factory threw itself into the effort on a scale that dwarfed everything before it. Even before the United States entered the fighting, the company took large contracts to supply the armies of Britain and its allies, building military rifles by the hundreds of thousands. When America itself joined the war, Winchester became one of the principal makers of the standard American service rifle, turning the lever gun works to mass producing a modern bolt-action battle rifle. The workforce swelled as men and, increasingly, women crowded into the workshops as sons and husbands went off to fight. The company threw up new buildings almost overnight and took on great debts to finance the frantic growth, and that very expansion and the mountain of debt beneath it would one day help bring the company down. But that reckoning lay in the future. For now, the presses roared. Then, a generation later, it happened again, on a scale larger still. When the Second World War came, Winchester once more became a giant of American war production. The company was called upon to help build the standard rifle of the United States infantry, the celebrated semi-automatic M1 Garand that gave the American soldier a decisive edge in firepower. Winchester received an early educational contract to learn how to manufacture the complex rifle, then went into full production, ultimately turning out roughly 500,000 M1 Garands from the New Haven plant. But its most distinctive contribution was a smaller weapon, the M1 Carbine, a light, handy rifle for soldiers who needed something better than a pistol, but lighter than a full battle rifle. Winchester engineers played a central role in perfecting the winning design, and the factory built it in staggering numbers, on the order of 800,000 among the more than 6 million made across the country. And all the while, the ammunition works ran day and night, pouring out cartridges and shotgun shells by the tens of millions. This was the true peak of the Winchester Empire. At the height of the war effort, as many as 20,000 men and women at a time streamed through the gates at the corner of Winchester Avenue and Munson Street, working around the clock in a small city of brick and steel. For a few extraordinary years, The factory Oliver Winchester had dreamed into being stood as one of the mightiest engines of production on the planet, its name stamped into millions of rifles and cartridges. There is one strange thread woven into the Winchester story from these years, though it is a footnote and not the main tale. It concerns Sarah Winchester, the widow of Oliver's only son, William Wirt Winchester, who died young of tuberculosis not long after his father. Sarah inherited an immense fortune and a large share of the company's stock. According to a famous legend, the grieving widow came to believe she was haunted by the spirits of everyone ever killed by a Winchester rifle, and that only by building endlessly could she keep them at bay. She moved west to California and there raised the sprawling mansion in San Jose, now known as the Winchester Mystery House, a maze of stairways that lead nowhere and doors that open onto empty air. But those who knew her described a sharp, intelligent, and generous woman, and there is little real evidence for the tale. The legend, like so much around the Winchester name, has grown far larger than the facts. But the empire at its peak carried the seeds of its own decline, and the fall, when it came, was slow and painful. It began, as so many industrial tragedies do, with money. After the First World War, Winchester had taken on enormous debt to expand and tried to diversify into consumer goods, from cutlery to roller skates, hoping to keep its great factory busy in peacetime. The strategy failed. When the Great Depression struck at the end of the 1920s, the weakened company could not survive on its own. In the year 1931, the proud old firm that Oliver Winchester had built slid into receivership, unable to pay its debts. That year, on the 22nd of December, the Winchester Repeating Arms Company was sold at a bankruptcy auction. The buyer was the Western Cartridge Company, a successful ammunition maker led by the Olin family, and in particular by a driven executive named John Olin. They bought the fallen giant for a few $1,000,000 in cash and stock, for a company whose assets had been valued, before the crash, at some $30 million, one of the great bargains in American industrial history. Under the Olin family, Winchester survived, and by harnessing the ammunition business to the gun business, it even recovered some of its footing as the 1930s wore on. But it was no longer the independent colossus of old, now a division of a larger corporation whose priorities would reshape it in ways the old company's admirers would come to mourn. The most notorious of those changes came in the 1960s. Faced with rising labor costs and fierce competition, the company undertook a sweeping redesign of its famous rifles, applying cheaper manufacturing methods to guns that had been built for generations with painstaking craftsmanship. In the year 1964, the redesigned versions of the beloved Model 94 and the Model 70 reached the public, and the reaction was swift and brutal. To longtime shooters and collectors, the new guns looked and felt cheaper. Stamped parts had replaced machined ones, and the old deep bluing and hand-fitting were gone. The verdict was harsh, that Winchester had sacrificed its legendary quality to save a few dollars, and the phrase pre-64 became a mark of honor, a way of saying a rifle had been built in the good years, before the cost-cutters came. It was a wound to the reputation from which the brand never fully recovered. The long twilight continued. In the year 1980, after a bitter labor dispute and a walkout at the New Haven plant, the Olin Corporation decided to get out of the firearms business altogether. It sold the historic factory to a group of its own employees, who incorporated as the U.S. Repeating Arms Company and took a license to keep building rifles and shotguns under the storied Winchester name, while Olin kept the one part of the business that still reliably made money, the ammunition. But the enterprise was fragile. The employee-owned company went bankrupt before the decade was out and passed through foreign hands, first to a French holding company and then to the Belgian arms group that also owned the great names of Browning and F.N. Herstal. The rifles still said Winchester on the side, but the company that made them was no longer American, and the old factory was living on borrowed time. The end came in the year 2006. In January of that year, the owners announced that the New Haven plant would close. On the 31st of March, the machines fell silent for the last time. The last 200 or so workers gathered their tools and walked out the gates. And gunmaking in New Haven, which had run without a break for roughly 140 years, simply stopped. The great brick armory that Oliver Winchester had raised from a shirtmaker's fortune, that had armed a nation across a continent and through 2 world wars, stood empty at last. Its whistles quiet, its presses cold, its long story finished. And yet the name did not die. The factory closed, but the legend it had made was far too large to close with it. The Olin Corporation, which had held the trademarks all through the long decline, signed a new agreement in that same year of 2006, licensing the Winchester name to the Browning Company under its Belgian ownership, so rifles and shotguns bearing the famous name could still be made, though no longer in New Haven. And the ammunition carried on under the Winchester brand as well, the cartridges still rolling off production lines, the name still stamped into brass by the million. In a very real sense, the ammunition outlived the guns, and Winchester survived, in altered form, into a new century. The true legacy of Winchester was never about which corporation owned the trademark, but what the rifle and the factory had come to mean. Over a single extraordinary century, Winchester had become the very symbol of the American frontier. When people around the world pictured the cowboy on his horse, the settler at the door of his cabin, the lawman walking down a dusty street, the rifle in their hands was a Winchester. It rode through 1,000 tales of the West, in books and on countless movie screens. The gun that won the West did not just help win the West. It became the way the West would be remembered forever. And behind that legend, always, stood the factory. The true miracle of Winchester was never a single gun, but the great works in New Haven, and the tens of thousands who gave their working lives to it. Oliver Winchester, the shirtmaker who knew nothing of guns, understood that the future belonged not to the craftsman, but to the factory, and he built one of the mightiest the world had ever seen. From it flowed the tools of a nation's expansion. The rifle of the frontier and the arms of 2 world wars, poured out in numbers that would have seemed like sorcery to the men who fought at Little Bighorn. The plains are fenced now. The frontier is long closed. The great factory in New Haven stands silent. Some buildings gone, others reborn as apartments and offices where the drop hammers once shook the ground. But somewhere out in a barn or cabin or quiet collection, an old lever gun still rests, its steel worn smooth by 100 years of hands, that single proud name stamped into the metal. A small enduring piece of the armory that helped build a country and the West it reached for. If you have enjoyed this journey into the story of Winchester, the rifle that won the West, and the great New Haven factory that built it, then please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and to like this video. It truly helps us keep telling these stories of American industry, ingenuity, and the men and machines that shaped a nation. There are many more monumental tales still to come of the factories, the founders, and the frontier that made America. So subscribe now, ring the bell so you never miss a new film, and we will see you on the next journey into history. Thank you for watching, and thank you for remembering.